it goes on. Just going to re-record this first bit so it's all clearly there in as a catch-up, basically, for that first section. We're going to talk about suspension of disbelief is the sort of contract between reader and writer. The reader knows it's fiction, knows that the storyteller is telling something not true, and it would be easy to disbelieve it because you know this fact, and yet somehow there's a contract of disbelief, a suspension of disbelief. A contrived plot, perhaps one that's over tightly plotted or just seems too convenient, can ruin that, in the same way that an arbitrary plot, or one that feels too random, might simply lose interest because it won't feel that it's really a sort of coherent story anymore. So this is an important aspect in achieving authenticity in a plot, and you can explore it as well through games and work in the classroom to see what feels too random. When does a plot break down? When does an episodic plot become meaningless? And when does a tight plot, an action plot, feel almost contrived? And when does contrivance ruin that? So that's a very rich area when we've been talking about using film and drama and thinking about how to adapt text in the classroom, and also how to think about texts ourselves for our own, sort of purposes and for literary analysis. So I talked about, I'm just reviewing here quickly as well for all our merry YouTubers, the exposition, the setup in a plot. And we've looked very much, when we've looked at books and films, very often we've looked at opening scenes, we've looked at opening chapters, we've looked at the setup, the exposition in the beginning, because it tells us so much about character, setting, and conflict, as well as really starting off by showing us how the story is being told, plot, and perspective. Conflict is vital. Conflict can be multiple, but it's normally singular and linked to the protagonist. You normally have a main conflict. I was discussing earlier the Queen in The Sleeper and the Spindle, how effectively Shaggy Gaiman establishes setting in the exposition and character, and then the conflict that the Queen doesn't feel she really has any choices, that she's locked into her destiny as a fairy tale character, and how she wants to break out and express her individuality. And that's the sort of hymn of self-determination, if you will. And for this, it's typically conflict is between the protagonist and themselves, or another character, or society as a whole, or nature itself. And here we can see that the Queen has a conflict with herself and with society. In this section, snappily entitled "Don't Lose the Plot," did you get it? We introduced, and we've already started looking at, when I looked at plot structure, I introduced plot diagrams. And this is another very useful technique in terms of thinking about how stories are structured and how you yourself can then engage in creating stories, whether you're going to film them in clips and post them online, or whether you're going to act out scenes. You can also plot scenes and use this sort of plotting as an aid in the classroom. In the plots, we talked about the beginning being essentially what's called the exposition, which sets out character, setting, and conflict. The middle section, let's say it's a simple scene or a dramatic plot, includes the rising action to the climax or turning point. And then in the final third or ending, that turns into falling action from the climactic point or apex in the denouement or resolution. Choices of words there as well, as you can see. Some of them a little less easy, like denouement, but resolution is available, and we've used how the plot resolves itself. Good bit of terminology there. This is often referred to as a story arc or a narrative arc. Narrative just means how anything is told, and can be used to analyze scenes or describe scenes, episodes, which we know can also be chapter length and look at chapters. I've banged on for time untold about Dickensian chapters, numbers as they were called, which is where a lot of this sort of plotting began very strongly in terms of the sort of the chapter cliffhanger. And obviously the whole book as well, and went through a little bit of a sort of idea of the plot of Cinderella there. It's a sort of dramatic plot, quite a simple one, and perhaps we can look at The Sleeper and the Spindle and contrast it to a fairy tale plot in our next task. I then cheekily got in a Star Wars reference, just because I do a James Earl Jones impression that's rather good, and match that with some plot devices, some of which like frame stories or story within a story in media res as a sort of flashback plot structure with flashbacks and forwards we've already looked at. The red herring, the false plot solution that's used to heighten tension or produce an anticlimax. Deus ex machina, some sort of, they all died in a fire type ending that solves plot problems, normally sort of an act of God. We've looked at the foreshadowing, which often points to some sort of plot twist. The dangler, the Australian dangler, or the cliffhanger on the chapter ending, which I've seen people already using very effectively. The what's going to happen next ending. We also talked about plot coupons, rather like rewards in a game that you pick up to get through a level, and plot vouchers, particularly, for example, in fantasy, the mystery object whose use we do not know that then comes in use later to solve an issue. Then I ended up talking about suspense and how it's inimical to empathy for a character and their dilemma, mystery, or repetition to build it. So that nicely sort of reviews and concludes that section there. I'm going to stop the video. Goodbye, YouTubers.